Hey everyone, I'm Danielle O'Gorman and I'm here today with a fairly short introductory lecture to counterplans. So if you are very new to the concept of what a counterplan is, this is a great lecture for you. If you are somewhat familiar with counterplans, but you want a review of the terminology or some of their strategic uses, this would also be a really good lecture for you. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so this lecture is called Introducing Counterplans and How to Debate Them. It would be perfectly appropriate for you to watch this as a review and then move on to the more advanced counterplan lecture. That I think is a really great idea. So just so you know. What is a counterplan? So a counterplan is what policy debaters call an alternative advocacy to the plan that operates in the policy realm. So it is a little distinct from a critical alternative, which might also be an alternate advocacy to the plan. And a counterplan has to be competitive. It has to compete against the affirmative. So another way of saying that is that it has to be mutually exclusive to the plan, or there has to be an opportunity cost to doing the plan and the counterplan, right? So, so it has to be a better option in some way than the affirmative, or than the affirmative and all or part of the counterplan, which is what we call the permutation, which is an affirmative argument against a counterplan, which we'll get to in a minute. So how do you prove a counterplan is a better option? So one way that you could do that is that you could prove that the counterplan by itself, so not the permutation, not the counterplan plus the plan, is net beneficial. And usually in debate, we do that by reading a disadvantage or a case turn that is a net benefit to the counterplan. And what that means is that the argument links to the affirmative, but it doesn't link to the counterplan. You could also prove that the permutation, so doing both the counterplan and the plan, is a bad idea by reading a disadvantage or a turn to the permutation. Or you could prove that the two are just like mutually exclusive. You couldn't do both. So if the counterplan like bans the plan, that would be mutually exclusive. But generally to win the debate, you have to prove that the counterplan is both mutually exclusive and that there's some net benefit. So it's still a better idea to do the plan or to do the counterplan than it is to do the plan. So you still have to win a net benefit. Do counterplans have to solve the case? Do they have to solve the affirmative advantages or the harms that the affirmative outlines? No. They could solve the case, and many of them do attempt to solve all or part of the affirmative, but they don't have to. So they could also just be used to prove that the disadvantages to the case outweigh solving the case. Or they could exist merely to make a disadvantage less susceptible to link uniqueness arguments or uniqueness arguments. So those are called uniqueness counterplans. So here are some of the types of counterplans. This isn't necessarily an exhaustive list. So one type of counterplan is called a plan-inclusive counterplan, which in debate we often abbreviate as a PIC because it does some part of the plan. So it might not do, it obviously doesn't do the entirety of the plan, but it excludes part of the plan. My debaters always want to know why we don't call this a plan-exclusive counterplan, because it excludes part of the AF, which is a great question. I guess it's because PECs is not as fun to say as PICs, but it includes some of the affirmative plan advocacy. But it doesn't do all of it. And then it reads a disadvantage to the part of the plan that it doesn't do. So it picks out a part of the plan and then reads a disadvantage to that so that there is a net benefit to only doing the parts of the plan that the counterplan advocates. An agent counterplan is sometimes talked about as though it is a type of plan-inclusive counterplan because it does the plan, but it uses a different agent than the affirmative does. So here, if we had the court do the plan, right, if the affirmative had the Supreme Court as the actor of the plan, the counterplan might do an executive order, have the president issue an order that does the same thing that the Supreme Court would functionally do. There are also advantage counterplans, and an advantage counterplan uses a completely different mechanism to solve one of the impacts to the advantage that the plan attempts to solve. So a great example of this is from years and years ago, but on the nuclear weapons topic, my debaters read an affirmative that banned ICBMs, and one of the advantages to banning ICBMs was that would be how you would launch nuclear weapons into space, and so we claimed to solve for space weaponization or like space prolif, and the negative counterplan argument was just ban space prolif, which was like a good enough argument that we stopped reading that advantage. So you can see how it's an entirely different mechanism from the plan, and so you can read any disad to like the plan's action, right? So you could read a disad that was like ICBMs are good for deterrence, and then we should just ban space weapons as the counterplan, and you solve that advantage but don't link to the disad. Process counterplans generally engage in a different, as opposed to an agent counterplan, which uses a different person to do the plan, the process counterplan does the plan in a different way. These are sometimes theoretically a little bit suspect. So I don't know if you all, when you watched the Will Jensen topic lecture, saw him talk like very briefly about like consult NATO or consult Japan, just as the sort of like varsity debaters were bringing it up. And consulting another agent is an example of a process counterplan, because we would say that like normal means would be that on domestic policy, the United States acts unilaterally. We don't like ask our allies, like, what do you think if we like banned the police? Is that cool? We tend to do those things without consultation of major allies. And so that would be a change in normal means, but it would do the entirety of the plan. It would just ask Japan or ask NATO or ask Canada first. And the reason for that is to avoid making that country angry or upset about changes in our policy that would hurt our relationship with them. They're theoretically kind of suspect, I say, as a person whose team runs them all the time. So you just have to be good at debating the theory of them to like really kind of get away with that. And then the final one I have on here is uniqueness counterplans, which we discussed a slide earlier, which just creates a situation. So if you think that the uniqueness to the disad that you have is suffering, you can read a counterplan that provides slightly better uniqueness for it. And so actually kind of an example of that is there are versions of the state's counterplan when you think that the uniqueness to the federalism DA is not particularly good. You can read a particular version of the state's counterplan that sort of counterplans uniqueness into the disad. And it also is an agent counterplan, right? States counterplans are agent counterplans, but that counterplan has sort of two purposes if it's written in a particular way. So one question that negatives ask a lot is how to extend a counterplan in the block. And so I think that when you are extending the counterplan either in the 2NC or the 1NR, it's really important to give an overview. I think especially in kind of very technical or fast counterplan debates, it's very difficult sometimes to figure out what the distinction between the counterplan and the affirmative is, right? And so this is one of the places where the negative has the ability to clean that up and say, look, the affirmative does X, Y, and Z thing. The negative only does X and Y thing, and then we read a disadvantage to Z, right? So that's a description of the pick and what the net benefit is. I think the other thing to do is make very clear what the counterplan does. If it intends to resolve all or some of the affirmative advantages, how it does that. So what the counterplan does that is different than the AF, and then why that still solves the advantage, I think is a great thing to have in the overview. I don't think your overview should be longer than like 20 or 30 seconds because you really want to get that out of the way very ly and then go on to the line by line. And so the line by line is how we talk about flowing, and that's where there's the list of the arguments that the affirmative has made in the order that they've made them, and you want to make sure that you are answering those arguments kind of point by point. And that's important all over the flow, that there's not a part of the debate where that's not important, but I would say on counterplans, that is super important because you don't want to miss particularly a theoretical objection to the counterplan. So one of the ways that the affirmative is going to answer the counterplan is by saying that it's cheating, right? That it's theoretically illegitimate and you shouldn't get to do it. And so that in particular is going to require good flowing, attention to detail, potentially asking questions about the theory objections, and then answering them appropriately and in the place where they belong. So I will say on counterplans, that is like the place where my flow is most likely to get messed up, that there is a theory debate that is just either a gaping hole because y'all have kind of jumped around on the flow, or it's just messy. And I would also say that in the block, good time allocation is key. So you don't want to spend, all of your time on the counterplan because you still have to win probably case arguments to win a, even though the counterplan doesn't solve all of the AF doesn't solve all of the AF either. So the counterplan kind of solves enough of the AF. And you also have to win the net benefit to the counterplan. So you don't want to like over-invest time on the counterplan itself. So those are some suggestions for extending a counterplan. Let's say you're AF and somebody reads a counterplan against you. Oh no, what do you do? So just like we had an acronym for how to answer a disad, right, TULIP, we also have an acronym for how to answer a counterplan. And I use the acronym POTS. Some people use the acronym STOP, which maybe makes sense more than POTS does, but it puts the permutation at the bottom, and I think the permutation is probably the most important argument that you can make against a counterplan, and so I want you to make it at the top so you don't forget or run out of time. So if you're the 2A, you want to make 4 types of arguments. You want to make a permutation, and that is an argument that the plan and the counterplan are not mutually exclusive. You want to read offense against the counterplan. So you want to turn the counterplan itself, say the counterplan's a bad idea, or more likely you want to turn the net benefit to the counterplan, right? Which we talked about when we talked about turning a disad. So a net benefit is just a disad or a case turn, and so you can just turn the net benefit. T is theoretical objections to the counterplan. So that's like, the counterplan's not fair, it's cheating. And we'll talk about those in a second, but you should make sure to make those arguments. And then S is solvency. And so you want to make the argument that the counterplan doesn't solve the case. It doesn't solve the advantages. And you can separate those out and be like, the counterplan doesn't solve advantage 1 because of this reason, and the counterplan doesn't solve advantage 2 because of this reason, right? Okay, so POTS. Don't forget POTS, but also don't forget what POTS stands for, which is permutation, offense, theoretical objection, and solvency. So theoretical objection is the one that I think maybe is the most difficult to understand. And there are a bunch of ways to theoretically attack a counterplan. There are some that in sort of this day and age are going to be more persuasive to judges than others. And I'm including some of the more old school ones here in case you debate in kind of a more conservative circuit. And because you've probably heard these arguments before, even though I don't necessarily recommend like making them. So the first question is, can the negative run a counterplan? Does the negative get to fiat a worldview? Right? And under a very traditional understanding of policy debate, only the affirmative got fiat power. It's pretty well settled today that the negative gets sort of corresponding fiat power. Yeah. So I would say generally this is not a great theoretical objection to make against a counterplan. Does the counterplan have to be non-topical? In most circuits, no. There are some more conservative areas of the country when it comes to debate theory where, yes, the rule is that the counterplan has to be non-topical, but generally counterplans can be anything that's not the affirmative. Or they can even be just as long as they're not the entirety of the affirmative, right? So a plan-inclusive counterplan may be topical, it just doesn't do a part of the affirmative. Are the different types of counterplans fair, right? So is an agent counterplan fair? Is it fair to say that we should do the entirety of the AF, but just somebody else should do it? Is it fair to say that we should do the entirety of the AF, but we should just like phone a friend and ask NATO if they're cool with it first? Is it fair to do almost all of the affirmative, but not the entirety of the affirmative? Answers to that vary. I would say generally the default is that picks are usually okay. Agent counterplans are usually okay. Process counterplans that result in the entirety of the affirmative passing, even if you vote negative, are kind of like a question mark for a lot of judges. So I think some of that is if you go and you look up a judge and you look up their judging philosophy, which you can do for most judges, you can find out whether or not they think like consult counterplans or other types of process counterplans are legitimate. It generally says in their judging philosophy. So the big theoretical objection that I think a lot of people are familiar with debating and generally debate a lot is the question of, does the negative have to advocate the counterplan in the 2NR? And this argument is referred to as conditionality. And when you're affirmative, the question you want to ask the negative team after they've given the first negative constructive is, what is the status of your counterplan? It's really sort of obvious if they're reading more than one. They can obviously only pick one of those generally by the 2NR. But if they're only reading one counterplan, you need to ask, what is the status of your counterplan? Some people simplify it down even more so that there's less like, well, blah, blah, blah. And they just say, does the counterplan have to be in the 2NR? So there are three kind of statuses. right? Really, there's only two, but we'll talk about three. So the first is unconditional, which some people just say straight up, which generally does mean, yes, the counterplan must be in the 2NR. We have read it, so the status quo is no longer an option. It is in the debate until the end. It is the only advocacy that the negative can go for in the 2NR. They can't even go back to the status quo. Dispositional is this kind of like intermediate ground, and nobody really knows what it means. It means sort of various things. So if you ask your opponents, what is the status of the counterplan, and they say dispositional, you should respond with, what does that mean? Generally, most people will say it means that if the affirmative team doesn't read offense against it, if the affirmative team reads offense against it, they have to kick it, right? So if you straight turn the counterplan, right? So if the only thing you read against the counterplan is offense, then the negative is stuck with it. If you read defense that can be used to make that offense go away, or if you read other theoretical objections to the counterplan that aren't dispositionality bad or conditionality bad, then they can extend those arguments and make the counterplan go away, because the counterplan should never have existed, right? So this theory of debate or theory of like how counterplans work is supposed to be more similar to how disads work, because when you're kicking a disad, right, you have to extend defense to make the offense go away, which in my lab we'll talk about in a little bit. But in the world of a counterplan, that's a little bit complicated, and most people don't really do that. So most people will say the counterplan is conditional. And that actually, you need to still follow up the question with, if they say, so you say, what's the status of your counterplan? They say conditional. You respond with, does the counterplan, do you have to kick the counterplan before the 2NR? Do you have to decide whether you're going to go for the counterplan or the status quo before the 2NR, or can the judge do that for you? So there are kind of two theories of conditionality. One is the sort of maybe more old school one, which is like the negative needs to make a strategic decision and pick a worldview, either the counterplan or the status quo, before the 2NR happens. And so you only get one advocacy in the 2NR. The sort of newer plot twist to conditionality is that the negative can extend the counterplan if the judge decides the counterplan doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Either it links to the net benefit, or it is bad, or it doesn't solve the AF, or whatever. The negative can then still gets the status quo as an option post the 2NR. So the judge can still decide, like disad versus case, I'm still voting negative even without the counterplan, even though they extended the counterplan. That's a little bit complicated, and I'm going to do sort of a secondary lecture on conditionality as an elective. So if folks are kind of interested in the theoretical intricacies of conditionality in particular, I think that is a good lecture to check out. But this is like the theoretical objection that I recommend you making. If the negative says we are conditional, the affirmative should say conditionality is bad, here's why. Yeah. So to conclude and kind of wrap that up, counterplans are a strategic weapon for the negative. It's a great thing to have in the arsenal. It means you do not have to say the status quo is good. You can say the harms are bad, right? The status quo is bad, but the AF doesn't solve them, and the negative has a better way of solving. And if you're affirmative, we've just given you kind of an outline of a lot of the ways to solve or to sort of resolve counterplans, right? So this sort of mechanism of pots, permutation, offense against either the net benefit or the counterplan itself, theoretical objections, and then the counterplan doesn't solve are kind of the important strategic weapons that the affirmative can use against a counterplan. So that's all I've got.